Hey everybody, GZERO is in Munich on the eve of the 62nd Munich Security Conference. I'd say this is the calm before the storm, but the storm seems to be upon us. It's very windy and rainy today. I'm with Benedikt Franke, Vice Chairman and CEO of the Munich Security Conference. It's great to see you.
Great to be here again.
So there have been many Munich moments over those 60 plus years, speeches that were memorable, agreements, disagreements, but I would say one that really stands out was last year when newly inaugurated Vice President JD Vance stood there and really laid out some very clear distinctions between the US and Europe that went far beyond just funding of defense or regulatory reform and got to the heart of differences in views of democracy. How have you seen that play out throughout this past year in terms of how Europe is reacting to the United States?
So I think what the Vice President Vance said on our stage did resonate. Yes, it freaked Europeans into cohesion. It resonated with large parts of the continent in as much as asking for a European moment, a moment where we finally get our act together, a moment where we finally wake up, and a moment where we finally cooperate, not against the United States or against anyone else, but to make more of what we have, to become a little more independent, a little more resilient, and a little better prepared in this world of uncertainties.
So those uncertainties play out in a new report that the Munich Security Conference just published. It's called Under Destruction, which is, of course, referring to the post-1945 order. I wonder, though, Benedikt, is that title a warning of what could come, or is it a diagnosis that we're already at a place where this is a dismantled global order?
Okay. I think it's actually both. In a way, this is meant as a conversation starter. It is supposed to guide this weekend through key questions like, is this order that we've grown used to, is it beyond repair? Is something new and better coming? Or is this the end of progress, the end of rules, and the begin of, as Gramsci said, a time of monsters? And this report is meant to be controversial. This report is meant to get people to talk. And I think when we look at the download figures, the plan is working.
Well, people are certainly talking. One of them is, of course, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, who fired back this week saying, we aren't the elephant in the room. We aren't the problem. And in fact, the moves that this administration has made are making NATO stronger. Do you agree with that?
So I think he is right. With his last point, yes, NATO is getting stronger. Allies are paying up. The 5% is a lot more than we would have thought possible had we sat here 2 years ago even. And so, yes, NATO, when it comes to spending, is better. But an alliance isn't just the money, isn't just the number of tanks, isn't just the number of planes. It's also the quality of trust. And here, I think we've seen some unnecessary dramas over the last couple of weeks, the Greenland issue being only one of them. And so I think it may be the case that the US administration is supportive of NATO. It may be the case that the US administration doesn't perceive itself as a threat to the alliance or to Europe. But if enough non-Americans believe that, then there certainly is a communication problem. We just hope that this conference here this weekend can help us, return to a path of constructive dialogue, use of existing processes and bodies, and just generally a rebuilding of trust.
Another moment when NATO seemed incredibly strong was, of course, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Right now, at this moment, when you see the Trump administration approaching Ukraine from a deal-making perspective, rather than a stalwart defense of sovereignty no matter what, how are you reacting to that? And are you worried about the precedent that sets moving forward?
You know what I'm worried about is that it always takes a plan or a move by a US president to move us Europeans. It should have been us that proposed a plan. It should have been us that proposed a way forward. We haven't done anything to deserve a place at the table. And so we shouldn't be surprised that others are taking these places for us. If we really want to save Ukraine, we need to up our game, with or without the US.
And when you say it should have been us to propose a plan, do you mean a deal should have been on the table sooner? Because there were many European leaders saying it's sovereignty or nothing. It's not about Ukraine without Ukraine.
So what I'm saying is this cannot be done behind the backs of the Ukrainians. And what I'm not proposing is, let's find a deal to end this at all costs. No, what I'm proposing is to get the Ukrainians into the best possible negotiation position going forward, and to make sure that they do not just not lose this war, but they actually win.
And what does winning it look like? What do you see as the next steps for Ukraine when this war finally comes to a conclusion?
Having defended their own sovereign territory successfully, having built a basis to rebuild the entire country, having overcome political divisions in the country, and being on a pathway to European and NATO membership.
Mm-hmm. So another really fascinating point in the report, the Munich Security Report that just came out, is the amount of pessimism among citizens of G7 countries about what their democracy is actually able to do for them and what the future looks like. Many people, when surveyed, saying they don't believe that the future is brighter than today. When you hear that, and then you look at some of the statistics that are right there in your report, that in the past 25 years, 1% of the planet has accumulated more than 40% of new wealth. We know for a fact that all of the sustainable development goals put forth by the United Nations a decade ago are not on track they are all failing, right? And there are more conflicts on the planet right now than there have been since World War II. So I guess what would the argument be that we should stick to status quo in terms of global order? And how are you approaching the need for reform with or without Donald Trump as a catalyst?
I think we would be the first to acknowledge that there is a huge need for reform. I guess the question is whether this is about iterative, nitty-gritty reforms, or whether it is about disruptive strategies. What we are seeing today is what our report team has called wrecking ball politics, where stuff is taken down without necessarily having a good plan to build something better up afterwards. We are also seeing that this disenfranchisement, this disappointment within populations, that their worries and concerns are, to a certain extent, justified. There are many people who can legitimately ask, what has this global order done for me? I am worse off than my parents, and my kids will be worse off than me. We need to make sure that we have better answers to give to them, and that we bring back hope, and that we set out a clear vision, define what good actually looks like. Because if we don't do this, the far right, the far left, populists will fill the void with easy answers, lies, and a construct that will never be able to solve the problems that we currently have. I just came from a lunch where somebody reminded me of the Gramsci quote, the famous Gramsci quote. The old order is not quite dead. The new order is not yet born. And this is a time for monsters. He said that in the late 20s. I think this is true today. And what we need is people who tackle the monsters. And again, I think this conference weekend offers a good opportunity for people not just to talk about the elephants,
right,
but also talk about the monsters.
But it's hard to know who the monster is, depends on what side of the conversation you're standing on, right?
But I think a lot of people would agree. I'm not talking about, monsters as people. I'm talking about problems. Inequality, you mentioned it. If we do not address inequality, this will all break apart at some point. It's absolutely unsustainable. Look at history. This is not sustainable. And so tackling these monsters, and in fact, climate change and some of these other things that aren't so popular these days anymore, those are all monsters we need to tackle.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I would just say the flip side of the pessimism we're seeing in the most developed nations is some optimism emerging from the global south, the places where that inequality is the most pronounced. How are you viewing both MSC's relationship with nations of the global South, but also moving forward, looking beyond transatlantic relations to global relations, and perhaps as new orders emerge, what role do you see the global South playing?
We are absolutely thrilled that we have so many leaders from the global South with us this weekend. I'm an optimist. And I know it's hard in this current moment of drama to find the silver lining at the horizon. But I think the fact that Europe and the global South are cooperating more often and more effectively, that new alliances are tried out and tested, that new ways to come up with multilateralism without US lead are tested, that should give us optimism. That should give us a sense of hope. I don't think it's going to be enough. We need a constructive US in the lead. And I think we need to do everything we can to make sure that average Americans, but also the American administration, sees and understands the value of multilateral cooperation and believes in the added value of working with allies and friends. And again, that's something we're going to try this weekend.
And this weekend, you're also going to have on stage a variety of American voices. So Marco Rubio, of course, will be speaking, but also Congresswoman AOC, as she's known, and Gavin Newsom of California. What message do you think that will send to Europe when you hear such different worldviews coming from the Americans on the stage?
You know, it's so interesting. This interest in the Democratic speakers is an American thing. We have had bipartisan delegations at this conference for over 60 years. We've had both sides of the aisle coming here and giving their messages, having meetings together, but also disagreeing on stage. We don't want to meddle.
It's business as usual.
Internal politics. We don't want to showcase the fragmentations or the dramas. But we do believe that regional governors like Governor Newsom has something important to add to the debate. And Congresswoman AOC is only one of many congressional voices on our stage. I know there's huge media interest in her appearance.
This is her big kind of international rollout, right?
We'll watch her with great interest, but there is no hidden message.
Right. Okay. Well, Benedikt Franke, best of luck. GZERO will be watching. Hopefully the weather will get a little better. And thanks so much for being here.
You will be blown away.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Great to see you.